Brexit, once a bold promise for a global Britain, has now left the UK struggling with unforeseen economic, social, and political chaos. What was meant to be the dawn of a new era has quickly turned into a struggle for survival. How did Brexit's grand promises turn into a nightmare? In 2016, the United Kingdom faced a monumental decision. Should it remain a member of the European Union, EU, or venture out on its own? This choice, known as Brexit, a blend of Britain and exit, was driven by a vision of a brighter, more autonomous future. Let's delve into the promises that fueled the Brexit campaign and captivated the nation. At the heart of the Brexit movement was the promise of reclaiming sovereignty. Advocates argued that EU membership had eroded the UK's ability to govern itself. They contended that decisions affecting British citizens were increasingly made in Brussels, often without adequate input from the UK. By leaving the EU, the UK would restore its parliamentary supremacy, ensuring that British laws were crafted by elected representatives in Westminster, not by distant EU officials. This promise resonated deeply with those who valued national self-determination and democratic accountability. Another cornerstone of the Brexit vision was the prospect of economic prosperity through independent trade. Proponents claimed that outside the EU, the UK could negotiate trade deals tailored specifically to its interests. They envisioned a nimble, global Britain, striking agreements with emerging economies and re-establishing ties with Commonwealth nations. This autonomy was seen as a pathway to enhanced economic growth, free from the constraints of EU trade policies that required consensus among multiple member states. Control over immigration was a significant promise of the Brexit campaign. Supporters argued that EU membership mandated open borders, limiting the UK's ability to manage the influx of migrants. They contended that this unrestricted movement strained public services and impacted job opportunities for British citizens. By exiting the EU, the UK could implement a points-based immigration system, prioritizing skilled workers and addressing specific labor market needs. This approach aimed to create a fairer, more controlled immigration policy that served the national interest. A prominent and memorable claim during the Brexit campaign was the financial savings that could be redirected to domestic priorities. The Leave campaign famously asserted that the UK was sending £350 million per week to the EU. They suggested that these funds could be better spent on the National Health Service, NHS, bolstering healthcare for British citizens. This promise of reallocating resources struck a chord with voters concerned about public services and fiscal responsibility. Brexit supporters also highlighted the promise of regulatory freedom. They argued that EU regulations were often cumbersome and stifled innovation. By leaving the EU, the UK could design its own regulatory framework, tailored to its unique economic landscape. This flexibility was seen as an opportunity to foster innovation, particularly in some important sectors like technology and biotechnology. The vision was of a dynamic, deregulated economy that could swiftly adapt to global changes and attract investment. The promise of strengthening global influence was central to the Brexit narrative. Advocates envisioned the UK reclaiming its position as a leading global power, not limited or hindered by EU bureaucracy. They highlighted the UK's membership in international organizations like the United Nations Security Council and the G7, suggesting that Brexit would allow Britain to assert its influence more effectively on the world stage. This vision included revitalizing relationships with allies and playing a pivotal role in addressing global challenges. Preserving cultural identity was another promise that resonated with many Brexit supporters. They expressed concerns that EU integration threatened British traditions and values. By leaving the EU, the UK could safeguard its cultural heritage and ensure that national policies reflected the preferences of its citizens. This promise appealed to those who felt that globalization and EU policies were diluting the distinctiveness of British culture. Reforming agricultural and fisheries policies was also a specific promise aimed at rural communities. Brexit proponents criticized the EU's Common Agricultural Policy and Common Fisheries Policy, arguing that they disadvantaged British farmers and fishermen. They promised that leaving the EU would allow the UK to develop its own policies, better supporting these industries and revitalizing coastal and rural economies. Enhancing democratic accountability was a recurring theme in the Brexit campaign. Supporters contended that EU institutions lacked transparency and were not directly accountable to British voters. By exiting the EU, the UK could ensure that its governance structures were more transparent and responsive to the electorate. This promise aimed to restore trust in political institutions and empower citizens in the democratic process. The grand vision of Brexit was multifaceted, encompassing promises of reclaimed sovereignty, economic prosperity, controlled immigration, financial savings, regulatory freedom, strengthened global influence, cultural preservation, policy reform, and enhanced democratic accountability. These promises painted a picture of an independent, thriving UK, charting its own course on the global stage. As the nation embarked on this new journey, the anticipation was palpable, and the world watched closely to see how these aspirations would unfold in reality. Could Brexit be the worst decision in modern British history? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section. In 2016, the campaign leading up to this decision was filled with promises of regained sovereignty, economic prosperity, and enhanced global standing. However, as the years have passed, the reality of Brexit's economic impact has become increasingly clear, revealing a series of challenges and unintended consequences that have significantly affected the UK's economy. One of the most significant economic impacts of Brexit has been the contraction of the UK's economy. Studies have shown that the British economy is approximately 5% smaller than it would have been had the UK remained in the EU. This reduction translates to a substantial loss in economic output, affecting businesses and individuals across the country. The Centre for European Reform estimates that this shrinkage has resulted in a loss of around £31 billion in tax revenues annually, funds that could have been utilized for public services such as healthcare and education. Brexit has introduced new trade barriers between the UK and the EU, its largest trading partner. The introduction of customs checks, regulatory divergences, and tariffs has led to increased costs and delays for businesses engaged in cross-border trade. According to a report by the BBC, goods trade between the UK and the EU has experienced a significant decline, with economists warning that the situation is worsening. The added bureaucracy and costs have made UK exports less competitive, leading to a decrease in demand and a subsequent decline in production. Uncertainty surrounding the UK's future trade relationships and regulatory environment post-Brexit has led to a decline in both domestic and foreign investment. Businesses are hesitant to commit to new projects or expand operations without a clear understanding of the UK's economic direction. The Office for Budget Responsibility has noted that business investment has remained subdued since the Brexit referendum, contributing to slower economic growth and productivity. This hesitation among investors undermines the UK's potential for innovation and long-term economic development. The end of free movement between the UK and the EU, which was finalized in 2020, has led to labor shortages in various sectors, particularly those that relied heavily on EU workers, such as agriculture, healthcare, and hospitality. The new immigration system has made it more challenging for employers to recruit the necessary workforce, leading to increased labor costs and, in some cases, business closures. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research estimates that these labor shortages could reduce the UK's GDP by an additional 1.5% over the coming years. Brexit-related trade barriers have contributed to higher import costs, which, combined with global supply chain disruptions, have led to increased prices for goods and services. Consumers are facing higher costs for everyday items, contributing to a rise in the overall cost of living. The Scottish government has highlighted that Brexit has led to higher energy bills and lower investment, further exacerbating the financial strain on households. The UK's financial services sector, a significant contributor to the economy, has also felt the effects of Brexit. The loss of passporting rights, which allowed UK-based financial institutions to operate freely across the EU, has led some firms to relocate parts of their operations to EU financial hubs like Frankfurt and Paris. This shift has implications for tax revenues and employment within the sector. The Office for Budget Responsibility has projected that the financial services sector could see a long-term reduction in output due to these changes. The economic impact of Brexit has not been uniform across the UK. Regions with economies closely tied to EU markets, such as manufacturing hubs in the Midlands and the north of England, have been disproportionately affected. These areas have experienced more significant declines in trade and investment, exacerbating existing economic inequalities within the country. Efforts to level up these regions face additional challenges in the post-Brexit economic landscape. During the Brexit campaign, supporters of Brexit suggested that leaving the EU would free up funds previously contributed to the EU budget, which could then be redirected to domestic priorities like the National Health Service. However, the economic downturn and reduced tax revenues resulting from Brexit have outweighed any savings from halted EU contributions. The anticipated Brexit dividend has not materialized, and public finances remain under pressure, limiting the government's ability to invest in public services and infrastructure. The pursuit of sovereignty through Brexit has come with substantial economic costs. The UK faces a smaller economy, disrupted trade, decreased investment, labor shortages, and increased living costs. While the desire for self-governance was a driving force behind Brexit, the economic challenges that have emerged highlight the complex trade-offs involved in such a significant policy shift. When the United Kingdom decided to leave the European Union in 2016, many believed it would lead to greater independence and prosperity. However, as the UK separated from the EU, unexpected problems arose, especially in trade and border management. Before the official Brexit in 2020, the UK enjoyed seamless trade with EU countries, benefiting from the free movement of goods. Leaving the EU introduced new trade barriers. Customs checks, regulatory differences, and tariffs became the new norm, complicating the once straightforward process of buying and selling across borders. This shift led to increased costs and delays for businesses. A study highlighted by the BBC noted that Brexit-related red tape has caused goods trade between the UK and the EU to decline, with the situation worsening over time. The introduction of customs checks and additional paperwork disrupted established supply chains. Products that previously moved freely between the UK and EU countries now face delays at borders. Perishable goods, like fresh produce, were particularly affected, leading to spoilage and financial losses for businesses. The increased time and cost to move goods forced some companies to reconsider their supply chain strategies, with some relocating parts of their operations to EU countries to avoid these hurdles. Small and medium-sized enterprises, which often lack the resources of larger corporations, were hit hard by the new trade barriers. Many SMEs struggled to navigate the complex customs procedures and absorb the additional costs associated with exporting to the EU. Some businesses ceased trading with EU countries altogether, finding the new requirements too burdensome. This retreat from international markets limited their growth opportunities and reduced the variety of products available to UK consumers. The Northern Ireland Protocol was established to prevent a hard border between Northern Ireland, part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland, an EU member. While it achieved this goal, it created a de facto customs border in the Irish Sea, complicating trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Businesses faced new checks and controls on goods moving to and from Northern Ireland, leading to confusion and increased costs. The protocol became a contentious issue, with ongoing debates about its implementation and calls for adjustments to ease the burden on affected businesses. Brexit also impacted the movement of people. The end of free movement between the UK and the EU led to labor shortages in sectors that relied heavily on EU workers, such as agriculture, hospitality, and logistics. For instance, the farming industry faced challenges in harvesting crops due to a lack of seasonal workers, leading to produce being left to rot in fields. The transportation sector experienced a shortage of lorry drivers, exacerbating supply chain issues and causing delays in the delivery of goods. The UK's departure from the EU also affected the financial services sector. London, a global financial hub, faced challenges as firms lost their passporting rights, which allowed them to operate freely across the EU. This loss prompted some financial institutions to relocate parts of their operations to cities like Frankfurt and Paris to maintain access to the EU market. The divergence in regulations between the UK and the EU introduced complexities for businesses operating in both jurisdictions, leading to increased compliance costs and operational challenges. The unforeseen trade and border challenges post-Brexit influenced public opinion. A significant YouGov poll revealed that voters across the UK overwhelmingly favored closer economic ties with the EU over increased trade with the United States. Even in traditionally pro-Brexit areas, there was greater support for prioritizing EU trade relations. This shift in sentiment prompted political leaders to consider policies aimed at reducing trade frictions with the EU and exploring better trade deals to mitigate the economic impact of Brexit. In response to the challenges, both the UK government and businesses have taken steps to mitigate trade disruptions. Investments in border infrastructure, hiring of additional customs officials, and the development of new IT systems aim to streamline the movement of goods. Businesses are exploring alternative supply chain strategies, such as sourcing goods from non-EU countries or increasing domestic production. Trade associations are providing support to help companies navigate the new trade environment, offering guidance on compliance and best practices. The long-term economic implications of the trade and border challenges remain a topic of debate. Some economists argue that the initial disruptions will subside as businesses adapt to the new realities, while others believe that the increased trade barriers will have a lasting negative impact on the UK's economic growth. The reduction in trade with the EU could lead to decreased competitiveness for UK businesses, potential job losses in affected industries, and higher prices for consumers due to increased import costs. The unforeseen consequences of Brexit on trade and borders have presented significant challenges for the United Kingdom. A major selling point for the Brexit move was the key promise to regain control over its borders and reduce immigration. The idea was that by limiting the number of people coming into the country, there would be more opportunities for British workers and public services would be less strained. Brexit supporters argued that leaving the EU would allow the UK to implement a points-based immigration system, prioritizing skilled workers and reducing the influx of low-skilled labor. The expectation was that this would lead to higher wages and better job prospects for domestic workers. Additionally, it was believed that reducing immigration would alleviate pressure on housing, healthcare, and other public services. Contrary to expectations, the reduction in immigration post-Brexit led to significant labor shortages in various sectors. The end of free movement meant that many EU citizens who had previously filled roles in industries such as agriculture, healthcare, hospitality, and logistics were no longer available. A report by leading researchers indicated that Brexit resulted in a shortfall of approximately 330,000 workers in the UK labor force, predominantly in lower-skilled sectors. For years, UK farms had relied heavily on seasonal workers from EU countries to plant, tend, and harvest crops. With stricter immigration controls, the number of available workers plummeted. This labor shortage led to situations where produce was left to rot in the fields because there weren't enough hands to pick it. Farmers faced financial losses, and consumers experienced higher prices and reduced availability of certain products. The National Health Service, NHS, had long benefited from the contributions of EU nationals who worked as doctors, nurses, and support staff. Post-Brexit immigration policies made it more challenging for these professionals to work in the UK. The result was a staffing crisis in many hospitals and clinics. Patients faced longer waiting times, and existing staff were stretched thin, leading to burnout and further attrition. The promise of reducing strain on public services by controlling immigration backfired as the healthcare system struggled to cope with the reduced workforce. The hospitality and retail sectors, known for employing a significant number of EU citizens, also felt the impact. Restaurants, hotels, and shops found it challenging to fill positions, leading to reduced operating hours and, in some cases, closures. The lack of staff not only affected businesses' bottom lines, but also diminished the quality of service, impacting the overall customer experience. The logistics sector, crucial for the movement of goods across the country, faced a severe shortage of drivers. Many of these roles had been filled by EU nationals, and with the new immigration restrictions, the pool of available drivers shrank. This shortage led to delays in deliveries, affecting everything from supermarket stock to manufacturing components. The interconnected nature of supply chains meant that delays in one area had ripple effects across the economy. Educational institutions, particularly universities, had benefited from the diversity and talent of EU students and staff. Post-Brexit, the number of EU students enrolling in UK universities declined, partly due to increased tuition fees and the perception of a less welcoming environment. This decline not only affected the cultural richness of campuses, but also had financial implications, as international students often pay higher fees, contributing significantly to university budgets. Recognizing the unintended consequences of the new immigration policies, the UK government began to make adjustments. Efforts were made to create more flexible visa schemes to attract workers in critical sectors. For instance, the seasonal workers pilot was expanded to allow more temporary workers into the agricultural sector. However, these measures often fell short of addressing the scale of the shortages. Public opinion on immigration began to shift as the realities of labor shortages became apparent. While there had been significant support for reducing immigration during the Brexit campaign, the subsequent economic and social challenges led many to reconsider. Businesses and consumers alike felt the impact of reduced immigration, leading to a more nuanced discussion about the balance between controlling borders and meeting the country's labor needs. The labor shortages had broader economic implications. Businesses facing staffing challenges were less able to meet demand, leading to reduced productivity and profitability. Some companies considered relocating operations to countries with more favorable labor conditions. Additionally, the increased labor costs associated with shortages contributed to inflationary pressures, affecting the broader economy. The reduction in immigration also had social implications. Many communities that had become culturally diverse due to the presence of EU nationals experienced a sense of loss as neighbors and colleagues returned to their home countries or chose not to come to the UK. This shift affected community cohesion and the vibrancy of multiculturalism that had been a hallmark of many UK towns and cities. The promise of controlled immigration post-Brexit was appealing to many, but the harsh reality revealed a nation unprepared for the consequences. Labor shortages across multiple sectors underscored the UK's reliance on immigrant workers and the challenges of implementing sweeping policy changes without fully considering the practical implications. With the impending Brexit in 2016 and then the final exit in 2020, leaders painted a picture of a global Britain. This vision promised a nation that would be more influential on the world stage, free to make its own decisions, and able to form new partnerships beyond Europe. The idea was that by stepping away from the EU, the UK could strengthen its economy, enhance its security, and boost its global standing. However, as time has passed, the reality of this vision has come into sharper focus. Supporters of Brexit argued that leaving the EU would allow the UK to reclaim its sovereignty and make independent decisions without needing consensus from other European nations. This vision included strengthening ties with countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and emerging economies in Asia and Africa. The underlying belief was that the UK, with its rich history and economic strength, could thrive outside the EU's framework. One of the main goals of the Global Britain strategy was to establish new trade agreements worldwide. While the UK has successfully negotiated deals with several countries, the process has been more challenging and slower than anticipated. Differences in regulatory standards, concerns over agricultural imports, and political changes have all contributed to the slow progress. Additionally, some of the trade deals that have been secured largely replicate agreements the UK previously had as an EU member, leading to questions about the net benefits of these new arrangements. In terms of foreign policy, the UK aimed to leverage its independence to play a more agile and decisive role in global affairs. However, without the collective weight of the EU, the UK's influence has in some instances been diminished. Collaborative efforts on issues like climate change, international development, and security have become more complex, as the UK now negotiates from a position outside the EU bloc. For example, coordinating sanctions against other nations or participating in joint military operations requires new frameworks and agreements, which can be time-consuming to establish. Additionally, the UK's absence from EU foreign policy discussions means it has less direct input into decisions that can impact European and global stability. Brexit has necessitated a re-evaluation of the UK's diplomatic relationships. While there has been a focus on strengthening ties with non-EU countries, maintaining positive relationships with European neighbours remains crucial. Issues such as the Northern Ireland Protocol, fishing rights, and citizens' rights have been points of contention, requiring careful diplomacy to manage. Furthermore, the UK's desire to position itself as a bridge between the US and Europe has been complicated by shifting geopolitical dynamics and internal political changes within these regions. The UK's departure from the EU has also impacted cultural and educational exchanges. Programs like Erasmus, which facilitated student exchanges across Europe, have been replaced by domestic initiatives that may not offer the same breadth of opportunities. Artists, musicians, and academics have faced new barriers to collaboration, such as visa requirements and restrictions on the movement of goods and equipment. These changes have the potential to reduce the UK's cultural influence and limit the exchange of ideas that drive innovation and creativity. Domestically, the pursuit of the global Britain vision has influenced public perception and national identity. While some citizens feel a renewed sense of pride and independence, others express concerns about isolation and the loss of international influence. The debate over Brexit has highlighted divisions within the UK, with varying perspectives across different regions, age groups, and socioeconomic backgrounds. These internal dynamics play a significant role in shaping the UK's approach to its post-Brexit identity and its efforts to unify the nation around a common vision for the future. As the UK continues to navigate its post-Brexit landscape, it faces both opportunities and challenges. The ability to set independent policies allows for tailored approaches to trade, immigration, and regulation that can be designed to meet specific national interests. However, the interconnected nature of the global economy and international relations means that collaboration and compromise remain essential. Building new alliances, maintaining existing partnerships, and effectively communicating the UK's value proposition to the world will be critical components of realizing the global Britain vision. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Brexit, hit that like button and share it with your friends. For more insights and updates on Brexit and beyond, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications.